Chapter 21, Part 4. We're at the end of our chapter here. But just to note, too, that when we were looking at surrealism, the psychological importance in Freud and really examining the mind, a lot of that comes into the very early 20th century because of World War I and just the devastation, and PTSD happens at that time for the first time that we recognize it now. We call it shell shock, if that makes sense. So unfortunately, World War I is not the end. We get into World War II, and then, of course, tragic wars after that, Korean conflict and Vietnam War, and we are actually in a war at this time in 2019, unfortunately. So, but there's some idealism, there's some hope that perhaps that won't happen. So with constructivism, we get into the precursor of the Bauhaus. This is our Vladimir Tatlin in 1913. He leaves Russia. He's a Russian artist, and he wants to make this monument. This was never built, and this model doesn't exist any further either. But he's breaking things down into basic shapes. So we have sort of a cylinder here. There's a cone here. And so we've got some basic shapes that we're going to break down into and then build this monument. And it was for the Third International 1919 to 20. It was never built. But one thing that happens is there's a bunch of Russians that leave, including our friend Kandinsky, and then Mondrian comes into play, and then they start this movement called De Stijl, and they were creating harmony between individuals in modern industry and technology. So think about how we realize now that these machines and mechanization and horror of humans being chewed up by technological advances in warfare, it's not going away. So we're trying to kind of come up with a way to create beauty and balance in the world. So that's a reaction. Organizing things, that's what starts to happen at this point in time in the Bauhaus. Really, there's the 100-year anniversary was this year. It was in 1919. So Gropius founds the Bauhaus, and he's trying to get into different disciplines and also different I don't know, there's color theory, and there's elements and principles are happening with these fellows, and then also they're exploring other materials such as textiles and pottery and all this other stuff that was kind of ignored before because painting and architecture and sculpture were the only important art forms. And then, with the advent of oil paint and tubes, painting becomes huge, and then after this, painting becomes huge again. But at any rate, Mondrian here in 1939, oil and canvas. So originally he starts to do floral scenes, and then he does some street scenes, and he starts to do the sort of bird's eye view or map view of a grid of a city where you'd have these big blocks, and then he decides to distill things, and he wants. This is page 496, the quote, the most universal signs of human order. So if you imagine right now, we're in the early 20th century, painting can be anything. We've had Fauvists, we've had Impressionists, we've had Realists, we've had Cubism, we've had all this stuff happening, and now you have to kind of decide as an artist what your art's going to be made out of. It's sort of an individual decision. There's a stylistic grouping like De Stijl or Bauhaus. They have these little subheadings, but these are smaller and smaller groups of people, smaller time frames, more rapid change than we were seeing before. If you think about the Renaissance, it lasted 200 years, and Surrealism, is much shorter. All these things are much shorter. At any rate, he's deciding that he's going to do the primary colors only, red, yellow, blue, and he's going to use these hard geometric black lines on white and then add a little bit of color intermittently. These are originally cityscapes. They get a little more abstracted to the point where, it's just lines and squares of color. Very famous work. You see it all over, and it was adopted for textiles. I don't know. I think it was done during his lifetime. Marcel Breuer with an armchair. See, we're getting outside of painting and drawing and sculpture here. We're getting into furniture design. And really, if you go to a design class, if you take any um, product design, furniture design, industrial design, architecture, anything to do with designing objects or architecture, you're going to get to the Bauhaus and you're going to study Breuer and Gropius and all the rest. So the idea that everything could be redesigned to make it more livable and simplified, lots of chrome and leather and chrome and glass. This is a chair, so we don't have glass, of course. But you see this for a long time. And so when we talk about modernism, when we talk about modern furniture, this is what we're talking about. Mid-century modern furniture, we're not quite there yet, but it's influenced by this, and some of the designs are similar, and we do use wood as well. The Danish modern furniture with the wood, we see that later, but Breuer sets this tone of a chair that's not upholstered, it's showing its bones, it's down to its basic elements. Similar, if you can see the relationship here, with Mondrian, with its simplified forms and shapes and down to its bare essentials. Okay, this is 39, this is 28. 1924, we have the Schroeder House. This is a really bad image. I don't know why it's so low res, but you can see the influence of Mondrian here, right, with our black rectangles and lines, and then we have a few primary colors here, but very simplified and not ornate at this time. Also, between the wars, we have the Harlem Renaissance. We have three American experiences going on here: African heritage, the legacy of slavery, and the realities of modern urban life. So you see this in a lot of portrayals with African American work, because do you want to celebrate what's happening or the good things, or do you want to show the darkness of slavery? And some artists do both, and both categories do get criticized. By one side believes that you should show all the darkness and the details, and the other feel like, well, we need to move forward. So anyway, we have the Harlem Renaissance, which is an amalgam of all these things, but we're seeing a rise in the U.S. for a temporary amount of time. This is pre-civil rights. The artist Douglas here is going to show us this piece. It's quite joyful, music and aspects of Negro life from 1934. So there's hope, there's flowers. I believe that is cotton and cotton picking, but it's hopeful. They're going up in the world and thinking about progress. There is a little bit of iconography here with the chained slave coming free. And then we have our jazz age and our dancing here. So in Harlem at this time, we have a lot of writers. We have a lot of musicians. There is a lot more status, higher status for the African American temporarily. Communism is one of those things that levels, and socialism levels a playing field, but as we well know, it did not take hold in America. And once World War II rolls around, it's gone for good. And then we have civil rights much later. So we see some Klansmen coming here on horses. So in some ways, this has the joy mixed with the sorrow, but there's a lot of things in this complex composition. But it does have a sense, I think, more to the right of progress and uplift and hope. And this guy is elevated here. So a complex piece, joys and sorrows mixed together.